Good afternoon, folks. This is Paul Baker from New Malden Library, leaving a review today for not just one book, but a series of books. We're talking about the Long Earth series, co-authored by Terry Pratchett and Stephen Baxter. Now, Terry Pratchett will need no introduction to many of you. He's the author of the wildly popular Discworld series, as well as being the co-author, along with Neil Gaiman, of the much-loved Good Omens, which was recently turned into a very successful television series. And Stephen Baxter, many of you will also know, he's the preeminent science fiction author in Britain at the moment. Author of sort of many series of books, some dealing with the far future, some dealing with a hypothetical past. Very well respected, very well regarded around the world as a writer of hard science fiction. So the Long Earth series, obviously I can't summarise the plot of a whole series of books. I believe there's 5 books in the series. But to give you a general idea, the basic idea is it's exploring the idea of parallel Earths, which is a pretty sort of well-trodden sci-fi trope, the idea that there are lots of different possible versions of planet Earth, lots of different possible alternate dimensions. But it's done in quite a unique way in this book. And we start in the near future, and one day, suddenly, everyone in the human race, or most of the people in the human race, are able to step into one of these parallel Earths. And the way it's structured is that if you go to sort of the Earth next door, it's basically identical to our Earth, except there are no human beings. The only Earth that has humans on is the one that we live on here. But then the further along the kind of sort of realm of possible Earths you go, the farther you get away from our Earth, the weirder things become and the more different it becomes. But it's only on our Earth here where there are human beings. However, in these other Earths, there are other sentient races, sort of too many to list here. But there are sort of various, let's say, sort of humanoid-like kind of races. My favourite ones, because I myself am a musician, are what are described as the trolls. And the reason I like them is their chief method of communication is they sing to each other, which really appeals to me as a musician. And there's plenty of others. There's one version of planet Earth where you encounter these sort of upright kind of dogs with attitude, and they've got a whole civilization, or sort of vast island-sized sentient entities. And one of the joys of this series is it really is about the joy of exploration, of sort of heading out into the wild and discovering different races, different sort of consciousness, if you like. And it's kind of very sort of preoccupied with that idea of exploration being an end in and of itself. And one of the lovely things I think about this series is the combination of the 2 authors. Now, Stephen Baxter is known as a writer of hard science fiction. Hard science fiction, for those of you who don't know, is science fiction which takes itself very seriously. It's very rigorously thought through. It's trying to imagine how future technologies and future civilizations might actually develop and pan out, as opposed to the other end of the sci-fi spectrum, like kind of Star Wars, which is sort of space fantasy really, or kind of space opera. Hard science fiction is a very rigorously thought through exploration of the future, and this is kind of Stephen Baxter's sort of raison d'etre. But on the other hand, you've also got Terry Pratchett in the mix, who is known for his warmth and his wit and his humanity. And you very much get the 2 things working side by side. The 2 authors have really brought both personalities into this series. So one good example, for instance, would be that in order for a human being to step into a parallel world, they have to construct what's called a stepper box, which is quite a Stephen Baxter type of idea. But then the power source for this stepper box is a potato, which is, I'm sort of pretty much assuming that idea came from Terry Pratchett because it's just kind of silly and it's kind of very funny. Another good example is that one of the chief characters in this series is a self-aware sentient android called Lobsang, and the way he functions and the technology behind how he functions is kind of thoroughly explored, and it's very well thought out. And that's the Stephen Baxter kind of side of things. But on the other hand, Lobsang claims to not only have a soul, but he claims to have the soul of a reincarnated Tibetan mechanic. So again, you've got the kind of Terry Pratchett kind of sort of sense of the daft coming in there. And I think it's kind of sometimes co-authorships can be a bit hit and miss, but in this one, they've really kind of brought the two sides of their personality together in a very sort of homogenous and kind of natural way. Just the intellectual rigor of Stephen Baxter and the humour and the wit and the warmth of Terry Pratchett. And one of the other things I love about this series is that, unlike a lot of science fiction, which can be quite dystopian, it's portraying quite a grim picture of the future, where kind of things have largely gone wrong, or it's kind of like an apocalyptic wasteland quite often. This series is very optimistic. It's a very sort of hopeful, optimistic vision of how humanity might respond and spread out when suddenly being presented with endless possible versions of planet Earth that they can go into. And it's certainly not without jeopardy and excitement. Each book has its own plot, and there's kind of very tense, it's kind of breathless action kind of going on in each book. But that's not really what this series is mainly concerned about. As I said, its main concern is just the joy of discovering the unknown. And that's really the point of the whole series. The joy of discovery, the joy of exploration, and the many weird and wonderful places that could take the human race into if it was suddenly presented with the ability to just go to infinite kind of parallel Earths. And as the series progresses, it kind of widens its scope. At one point, they start to visit kind of different possible versions of the planet Mars. Some versions of Mars have life, some don't. And then when it gets towards the end of the book, it really kind of expands its scope into a much more sort of cosmological point of view. I can say that without I'm not describing any spoilers there, but by the time you get to the latter stages of the series, it's really got its eyes kind of set on the stars. So that's a very brief summing up of the Long Earth series. It's exciting, it's intriguing, it's fascinating, it's incredibly well written, it's funny, it's warm, it's hopeful, and also, I think, a very easy read. Quite often, this kind of science fiction can be a bit laborious, and that's don't get me wrong. It's very well thought out and it's very well realised. It's just superb kind of world-building science fiction, but in a way which is very approachable and is very easy to read. Again, I think because of the combination of the different voices of the authors sort of going into this. In actual fact, the final book of this series was the last published work by Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett sadly passed away before the final book was published, but much of the work had already been done on that book, and then Stephen Baxter finished it and got it ready for publication. So the final book, which is called The Long Cosmos, was Terry Pratchett's swan song, and it's a really fitting epitaph for Terry Pratchett because his voice just permeates all the way through the series. So that's this member of staff's recommendation for the day, The Long Earth series by Terry Pratchett and Stephen Baxter.